Hello, everybody. Good evening. How are you? Woohoo! Good to see everybody. What a great crowd today. My name is Kim Ryder. I'm the Director of Operations here at the Wayne Theater. And on behalf of our staff and board of directors, our volunteers, whom we affectionately call our ambassadors, we welcome you here to the Wayne Theater. Thank you so much. I'm just going to take a couple of seconds to tell you about a few things that are coming up here at the Wayne Theater, and then we're going to be learning all kinds of great things. But this is, we're right in the middle of our Halloween season. Do you get it? See what I did there? Yeah. Anyway, we've been sort of celebrating a little bit, but we've got a wonderful show next weekend. We're doing Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. It's going to be right here on the stage next weekend. That's going to be the 26th through the 29th. So Thursday, Friday, 2 shows Saturday, and 1 matinee on Sunday. So we hope you can join us for that. Also, on the 30th of October, we have the movie Van Helsing, which I understand is just really scary and all kinds of good that way. So we're just kind of keeping up the Halloween spirit. But also we have, for the holidays, we have Elf coming to our stage, and that's going to be starting November 30th for the first 2 weekends of December. And Jason Hootie, magician and comedian, is going to be on our stage November 3rd. So we've got lots of great things coming up, and we're really glad to see you here tonight and hope we can see you again another time. And, well, Mr. Joe Kuiper is going to be taking it from here. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to stand up here so I have this large creature looming over my shoulder. It'd be very intimidating. Anyway, I'm Joe Kuiper. I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Museum of Natural History, and I'm going to be introducing tonight's speaker for both all of you as well as those folks beaming in online. But before I do that, I wanted to give you a quick update on our branch campus project. That is, for those of you who might not be familiar with this, right down the road, down the hill from the Wayne Theater, at the corner of Arch and Main, there's a large paved lot there. That's being transferred over to museum ownership, so we will take possession of that lot thanks to the city of Waynesboro. And with that, we are in the planning stages for a 28,000 square foot facility that's going to mainly be outreach. That is, it's going to be exhibits and public experiences that focus on the Blue Ridge and Valley of Virginia. So that is the local area right here. So where are we at with that? First of all, we've got some updated drawings out by the salamander table out front. So I just kind of have them sitting there nearby if you want to check those out. I'll be around afterwards if you have any questions. Also, just a couple of bits of information. We just recently received preliminary approval for our building design through the state's Art and Architecture Review Board, so that's an important step forward. And we are now asking the state for direct funding for construction. In other words, we want to move from the planning stages and the design stage to the point where we're actually moving dirt and putting a building up. So I could use your help with that. So reach out to your local elected officials, and you have to do it now because we may have some changeover. Well, there is going to be changeover. We have redistricting, we have retirements and so forth. So Delegate John Avoli out of Stanton and Senator Emmett Hanger have both been just amazing colleagues in this process. And also former Delegate Steve Landis has also been an amazing colleague in this process. They've given us so much support in the Virginia General Assembly. So please, if you can, reach out and thank them for their help. But after the elections in November, when we know who our elected officials are, please reach out to them. Tell them about the project. Tell them why you want it here in the community. We can give you numbers if that's what you need. We can give you an estimated number of visitors per year. We are anticipating about 65,000 visitors to that campus at the bottom of the hill here. We had an update on our economic development plan. It should be worth, for the downtown specifically, it should be worth over $4 million in economic activity per year. And in fact, a national organization just came out with why arts organizations like the Wayne Theater are so important. People who go to various programs or to exhibits and museums and so forth, they're not just spending money on that event or tour or whatever they're going on or viewing. They are spending money in other aspects of the community, and the average is about $38 per person beyond what they spend to attend the event. right? So when you start to look at 65,000 or maybe even more people coming to an area, it begins to add up for a community. So we are righteous. This is an educational outreach program, and we want people to know more about the Commonwealth of Virginia and its natural resources, but also it's an economic development program as well. And we think we'll be welcome from that standpoint. So please reach out to your elected officials. That's our call to action for tonight. But for the moment, let's kick back and enjoy some wonderful photos of some amazing creatures as well as some incredible information about them. And I'm very pleased tonight, I'm going to be introducing the Natural History Museum's new assistant curator of herpetology, the study of reptiles and amphibians. Dr. Arianna Kuhn came to us last year after a national search, and I will say it was a tough search. Why? Because there's so much talent out there out in the world of herpetology. So we started this national search. We got dozens of applicants from all over, really the world. We had some international applicants as well. And we narrowed in very quickly on Dr. Kuhn because of her particular skill set, her accomplishments, brought her in for an interview, and she brought a lot of energy to us. And I will say, this is a brand new program. She's a startup. The museum had never had a herpetology department before. It just hadn't been there. But when we had some retirements at the museum ourselves, we asked the curatorial staff, what should we be studying in the Commonwealth? What needs help? And they focused on herpetology very quickly, and we're very pleased. And so, Arianna, you had some really stiff competition. We're really glad that you're here. You really percolated to the top very well. Arianna comes to us with a BS in biology and an MA in biology from Villanova University. She also received her Ph.D. in what sounds to be a really cool program, a joint partnership between the City University of New York Graduate Center and the American Museum of Natural History. When she joined us, she was completing a postdoctoral fellowship through the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada. So she's been to a lot of different places. She's bringing this expertise to the Commonwealth. And so if you would all please give a warm welcome tonight to Dr. Arianna Kuhn. It's all yours.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction, Joe, and thank all of you for coming here tonight to hear me revealing some secrets of one of the most elusive but incredibly important groups of vertebrates that we can encounter right here in our own backyards. So I am a herpetologist, and as Joe mentioned, that means that I study groups of ectothermic vertebrates, reptiles, and amphibians. And I'm really excited for this opportunity to tell everyone not only about a group of animals that are very near and dear to my heart and my research program, but also a group that is really important to the biodiversity of Virginia. So as a herpetologist, Virginia is a really cool place to be, and I'm really excited to be here because the ecological complexity of the region has resulted in an amazing diversity of reptiles and amphibians. So as a biologist that's really inspired and interested in biodiversity, you might think I need to go to the tropics to see bizarre, abundant, endemic, or really high species richness. But in fact, right here in the state of Virginia, without leaving the borders, you can go outside and you can see 34 different species and subspecies of snakes. You can see 25 different species and subspecies of marine, aquatic, and terrestrial tortoise and turtle. You can see 28 different species of frog and toad, but these are not the only amphibians that you can see in Virginia. And in fact, there is another group of amphibians that you can only see at incredibly high levels of diversity if you come right here to Southwest Appalachia. And that group is salamanders. So as you can see from this map, no matter where you travel across the globe, you will never see more species of salamanders anywhere else but where we are right now. So in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have 59 described species and subspecies of salamander, and 3 of them are entirely endemic, meaning we can't find them anywhere else on Earth besides Virginia. And believe it or not, salamanders are rare or absent from many other countries. So if you were a herpetologist who was very interested in one of the most secretive, elusive, but incredibly unique groups of small vertebrates out there, Virginia is the place to be. And so for that reason, I propose this adjustment to our famous travel slogan. So people who are coming to Virginia don't miss out on what are often referred to as the jewels of Appalachia. And I'm going to tell you a little bit today just how they earned that name. So as I mentioned, this is a very elusive group of animals. Some people sitting right here in this audience may even be thinking to themselves, I've never even seen a salamander, or I've not seen very many. So before we begin, I'm gonna do a little bit of a test of the audience. I wanna know about your salamander knowledge before we begin. So the rules are, I'm gonna show you a picture, and if you think that this is a salamander, I want you to raise your hand. If you think the picture I show you is not a salamander, then keep your hands down. And there's no consequences to being wrong, so just raise them up if you feel like it. Okay, so animal number 1 pictured here. Okay, we'll keep going. Animal number 2. All right, now we're starting to get some brains are cooking out there. I love it. Okay, animal number 3. What's going on here? All right, number 4. And just know that I'm remembering everyone who did or didn't raise their hand so I can come and find you later. Animal number 5. What is that? All right, and number 6, this is the very last one. I can't pass up opportunities to show this animal. So that was the last one, and I will say I did try to trick you a little bit here, but it looks like some people already might know some things about salamanders, so that's awesome. And here's the big reveal. So if you said yes to the first 4 photographs I showed you, yes, these are salamanders, and not only are they all salamanders, but they're all salamanders that we can find right here in Virginia. Now I will say the last 2, although they are not salamanders, they are reptiles, and they were kind of a little bit of just an off question. I just wanted to show those pictures. So hopefully we kind of understand now that we have this idea of what a salamander is, but their body plans can be incredibly diverse, and they can be really bizarre looking. And these bizarre body plans are often paired with really unique adaptations, and that's what I really want to focus on today. Not just because I think they're cool, but because they're also really important to biodiversity in Virginia. So salamanders are ecosystem superstars. So in some places of southern Appalachia, the density of salamanders is so high that their collective mass actually outweighs the mass of all other small terrestrial vertebrates in the region, even though it's this animal that we don't often see. So as one of the most abundant vertebrates out there, they are really important parts of our ecosystems. So they eat invertebrates, which in turn eat fungi, which in turn help indirectly regulate one of the most important ecosystem functions out there, which is decomposition. And I know they seem small, and especially this tiger salamander pictured here, they seem really cute, but in many aquatic ecosystems, they are the top predators. They're carnivorous in their adult stage. And that's a really important part of the ecosystem as well that we don't often think about when we see salamanders. Sorry, whoop. Okay, so however, that doesn't mean that everything doesn't want to eat them, even though they are top predators in some aquatic systems. So from bears to turkeys to ringneck snakes and other birds, even large aquatic beetles pictured here, for almost anything living in the same environment as a salamander or their eggs or their larvae, a salamander for dinner is a really big treat. So not only do salamanders need a way to avoid predation, but frogs and salamanders and also other species in these ecosystems are really sensitive to external environmental factors. So they did survive the last global extinction event that wiped out non-avian dinosaurs, and yet salamanders are now faced again with another potential future extinction event, driven by things like climate change, pesticides, disease, and more. And we now know that about 41%, probably larger now, of all amphibians on the globe are threatened with extinction. And particularly for salamanders, 3 out of every 5 salamanders that you're going to come across in terms of species are going to be threatened with extinction. So this is a highly endangered group of animals, and despite being very important to all of our ecosystems. So now you might be wondering, how are salamanders so abundant in Virginia? How are there so many species when everything wants to eat them, competition for resources is really high, and external environmental conditions seem to be working against them? So what I'm going to tell you about today is just how resilient this group of vertebrates really is, how good they are at finding resources and food, how good they are at adapting to their environments to withstand some of these extinction threats, and colonizing new habitats. And I'll be using a lot of examples from right here in Virginia, so unless I tell you otherwise, these are Virginia salamanders, which is really cool. So one major defense mechanism that many salamanders have in their arsenal is toxins, and signals to communicate to predators that they have these toxins so they don't get eaten. This can be through really bright colorations that say, hey, you're not going to want to mess with me, you're not going to want to eat me, I'm toxic. But there's also a bunch of wonderful behavioral displays that salamanders engage with to also warn predators off. And this is called the Unken reflex, also one of my favorite words in biology. And this is where the salamander rears up and presents these oozing toxins coming out of its body, and that signals to predators, you don't want to eat me, this is going to be bad for you. In the case of this salamander, the predator was a photographer, but it's still a really effective and really interesting display. Some toxins are so effective, they actually result in the death of the predator. So this is a large aquatic beetle larvae here, and you can see it has incredibly large and powerful jaws. However, when tangling with this eastern newt, so again, that's another local species we have here, the toxins were so powerful that they resulted in the death of both the prey and the predator. But that is not always the case. So sometimes you have predators like this toad pictured here that are interested in eating a salamander. They go in for the kill, they take a bite, and what actually happens is these powerful toxins result in the death of the predator. And that can be incredibly good for these salamanders because it can mean that they can go on to live and fight and breed and eat another day. So wonderful to have in your arsenal these amazing toxins. So what happens, though, if you don't have these amazing toxins and you're a salamander? What if you don't escape the predator in time? Well, another secret weapon that many salamanders have is the ability to regenerate. This is an axolotl salamander from Mexico, and in scientific research, studies have been done to show that a fully severed limb can entirely regenerate to full functionality in just 10 weeks. And for sorry, I'm just missing the cue. Yes, and so for these axolotls, not only are they able to regrow things like their limbs or their toes, they can regenerate parts of the spinal cord and even parts of their brain. So they're these super regenerators. So what happens, though, for salamanders when you're not just the prey item, or what happens when you're interested in capturing prey and eating? Well, salamanders have some really cool adaptations for that too. They have awesome ways of feeding. So you might not expect this because they are really cute, but a lot of salamanders actually have some pretty gnarly teeth. And so this is a neatest salamander exhibiting that right here, and I also have a CT scan that's rotating to show those amazing teeth. They help to grab onto stuff like worms and other invertebrate prey and hang on. But in addition to their regular teeth, many salamanders also have teeth on the roofs of their mouths to help really lock in those prey items, which you saw when that skull was rotating here on the stage. And teeth aren't the only way that salamanders get their food. Sometimes their food is a little bit further away. And so in this case, some salamanders actually have ballistic tongues, like a chameleon, that project out of their mouths. And in fact, some species can shoot out their tongues with more instantaneous force than any other muscle in the animal kingdom. And this is that tongue in action. I promise the video is going. It's just really, really slowed down. So this is Eurycia wilderae. So this is a two-lined salamander capturing a termite using this amazing tongue projection. This is a species that's incredibly common in Virginia. And this video is slowed down, but it can project that tongue fully in just 2 milliseconds. And some species don't need a special tongue to catch their insects because they have another really, really cool adaptation. And this is an adaptation to a life completely underwater. So they're not terrestrial at all. Some species, like the mud puppy that's pictured here, not only retain their gills that they have in their larval stage so they can live and breathe underwater, but they also have a set of lungs, and they can breathe above water as well. This is a salamander, crazy body plan diversity. And some species have gone even further at this adaptation level to live underwater by losing some of their limbs. So this is a siren pictured right here. Again, this is another species of salamander that we've got in Virginia, and they have these gills for living underwater, and they have front limbs for moving around that aquatic environment, but they have no back limbs. And you might think it's maladaptive to lose your limbs, but in fact this happens a lot in the salamander kingdom. So some species don't lose their legs entirely, but over evolutionary times their limbs have become very, very, very miniaturized, like this Amphiuma pictured right here. Again, this is a salamander. So crazy and so unique. So they have these really, really tiny limbs, and they're incredibly adaptive because it also allows them to move through their environment just like an eel. And I think if you saw one of these being pulled out of a puddle, you would think someone had just pulled up an eel because of that body plan. But by retaining the last little bit of this limb, it's incredibly adaptive underwater because they can maintain their balance on these murky substrate bottoms while also having a lot of flexibility in their movement through these habitats. So it's really the best of both worlds. So not having limbs is actually not just for snakes. It's for lots of different reptiles and amphibians. In this reptile and amphibian world, many species have adapted to a life completely without legs. In fact, even though everything on the screen right now might look like a snake to you, the first one is an amphibian and the last three are reptiles. One of them is even a gecko. So it's a really fantastic and amazing but kind of common thing that happens in the reptile world that we don't think about a lot, because when we see photos like this, when we see these animals, we don't think of them being reptiles or amphibians. So it's a really fantastic way to adapt to a new environment and not compete for resources in your former environment. Other places that salamanders can go to reduce that competition is places like caves. And man, we've got some really cool caves in Virginia. There are several species of cave salamander here in Virginia. This is Eurycia lucifuga. This is the cave salamander, slender, delicate individual that lives in this really special place in caves known as the twilight zone. So this is a place where you're getting a little bit of light, but not a lot, very low vegetative growth, not that many predators, but also not that much prey. So this individual has to be really fast, and it also has this especially long tail, so when those predation events happen, there's a lot of tail there to regrow back. So it's an incredible way to kind of adapt to a unique environment, find prey, escape predators. Really, really beautiful salamander that I've been so fortunate to get to see a few times since I've been here. Another rock-dwelling species that we have is the green salamander. This is really one of those jewels of Appalachia. Also the first species of Virginia salamander that I ever got the chance to see. These are rock crack specialists. They have these flat bodies, large flat toe pads. This allows them to really easily slip in and out of crags, and as you can see from this photograph, this coloration is incredibly adaptive for camouflage when you're living on licheny, mossy rocks. And in addition to that, it's great that they love these moist and rocky crags that are really, really cooled down, because these salamanders are lungless. And actually, a lot of salamanders are lungless. And so they respirate through their skin. And that means the environment needs to be cool and have a lot of available oxygen. But not having lungs allows you to save a lot of space inside your body for other unique morphological adaptations. So some animals in the salamander world have developed really specialized and even extreme adaptations to this subterranean environment. And this one example that I wanted to share is the olm from Europe. So they hunt their prey in absolute darkness. And because they're in absolute darkness, they've developed a really powerful sensory system of smell, of taste, of hearing, of even electrosensitivity, because they've actually lost their eyes and they've lost a lot of the pigmentation in their skin. They're sightless, but they can survive without food for up to 5 or 10 years, almost not moving at all. And studies have shown that they at least can live up to nearly 60 years of life, which is pretty remarkable. Imagine finding a salamander. The salamander's older than you. It's really, really bizarre. For species that have not sought out these really unique and empty niche spaces where they could evolve very specialized adaptations to these environments, salamanders have also evolved really extreme resilience to external conditions. Some species have developed some really extreme tolerance to cold. So for a species that's already cold-blooded, being out in something like the snow is a really, really big deal. You are not going to find a snake out in this. But salamanders are fantastic. This is one of our beautiful local species, the spotted salamander, walking across the snow in the early spring to get to the vernal pools, displaying this beautiful tolerance. In cold parts of northern Asia, salamanders are particularly cold tolerant, not a place you'd expect to see a salamander. The Siberian salamander pictured here can actually survive having most of the liquids in their body freezing down below minus 55 degrees Celsius. So far lower than many vertebrates. And they can literally become frozen alive and can kind of stay in this dormant block of ice until conditions become better and warmer. And the life cycle of most, but not all salamanders involves hatching from an egg, living as a larva, and then with gills that allow them to breathe underwater, and then lastly, metamorphosing to become a terrestrial vertebrate individual living on land. And this is an example shown from the tiger salamander, which we have here in various restricted areas in Virginia. So this species actually displays metamorphic plasticity, meaning when conditions are particularly dry, when the puddles that they're hanging in as larvae start to shrink up and dry up really rapidly, they can actually expedite that metamorphic state into being a terrestrial salamander fast enough that they don't get dried out in their ponds where they live as larvae, which is really a fantastic way of withstanding environmental conditions that are not stable. And likewise, red-spotted newts, which I mentioned are one of the beautiful individuals that we have here in Virginia and elsewhere in the eastern United States, take a more drastic approach in times of drought. So typically they have 3 life stages. They're born, they become these terrestrial Fs that sometimes we see after a rain when we're going for a hike. They're really bright orange. And then when they are ready to breed, they go back into the ponds and they completely go through this amazing body reorganization of having a paddle-like tail and different coloration. Now, if their habitat dries out, they can actually transition back a 4th time to life on land if the ponds that they're living in during these breeding periods are not suitable. So that's a really amazing way to kind of be prepared for any different environmental conditions that you might be encountering, is just metamorphose back and go back to land, forget the pond, which I think is really interesting. And at this point, some of you might be thinking, well, Arianna, you have showed me that we have so many species of salamander here in Virginia, and there appears to be tons of them, the biomass of them being greater than the biomass of other organisms in their environment. How could I have not seen more salamanders? Well, one of the reasons is because a lot of salamanders are really, really small. So one of the smallest species in the world lives here in Virginia, the northern pygmy salamander. It's almost as small as a penny when it's an adult. But other species can be really big. This is the eastern hellbender, one of the largest species of salamander in the world, and is the largest species in North America. Their closest relatives actually live in China and Japan, and they can be as big as 2 meters long. These are big salamanders. And so now you're thinking, well, if they're so big, why haven't I seen one? Well, it would be really hard to find one if you didn't have a snorkel and a wetsuit and a field crew, and then in addition to that, a lot of luck. Many species here are could be big, they could be small, but they're all pretty cryptic, meaning they're out of sight, they're not out during the day, they are not out always during dry conditions. So unless you know where and when to look, you might not see a salamander. However, even though most species of salamanders are cryptic year-round, not all of them are cryptic year-round. So for some species, like the spotted salamander in the spring, when it's still cold, you get your first big rains, they're gonna come out in huge quantities and migrate to vernal pools to breed and lay their eggs, which is a really fantastic and amazing event to just see an animal that's so incredibly cryptic coming out in such huge numbers, and also a really, really stunning species as well. And they do this to get to these temporary pools made from snow melt and in the spring where they congregate for these breeding events. And this is kind of what it would look like if you were underwater and you were a salamander attending one of these breeding events. So if you don't have the chance to witness something like these beautiful spring migrations with these salamanders, finding salamanders can still be as simple as going out after a rain when the ground is still moist in the spring at night with your headlamp and looking around on the forest floor. Sometimes you don't see them right away, but they can come out in big quantities to hunt and interact with other salamanders. So these salamanders are not only a huge part of Virginia's natural heritage, but they are a big part of the global story of vertebrate diversity and origins. And the question you now might be having, which is the same question that I've had for a really long time, is why are Virginia's salamanders so incredibly diverse? And why is Virginia such a hub of salamander diversity? Where did all these species come from? And that is something that I'm actively investigating through my position at the Virginia Museum of Natural History and in my research program. But to answer this question about why Virginia's salamanders are so incredibly diverse, we first need to answer some other very important questions. This is how science works. You have a question and then you have 50 more questions to answer the first question. So to understand why Virginia's salamanders are so incredibly diverse, we also first need to know and be able to quantify just how many salamanders there are out there. And you might be thinking, how many salamanders could there be left to find? How many new species are there out there really? Well, what I want to point out in this map I have up here on the screen is that this is just representing numbers of species of salamanders that were just described in the year 2023 and no other years. So 15 new species were already described in 2023, which is really amazing. And not everywhere on planet Earth, but several regions of the world have had a big year for salamanders. And these are including, but not limited to, Boleta glossa muisca from Colombia, So this is one of those really cool ballistic tongue salamanders I told you about earlier. Andreas Chennai from China. So yes, that is a frog in the salamander's mouth. This thing is huge. Siren sphagnicola, so this is a seep specialist siren, so you can say that 3 times fast. So that's a new species from Florida. And Desmognathus canawa, right from North Carolina, so not very far from us. So now that I've shown you kind of that we haven't found every species of salamander that really exists out there, there's many new species to be described. How do we go about finding these new species and understanding them and describing them? So, and that is something that I'm actively working on with collaborators in Ohio and through the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And this is where science gets really fun for me, because not only do I get to be a biologist, but to answer this question, I have to start to become a little bit of a detective and then also a historian. So a lot of work has been done in the region over the years, but also every single year with science, we're coming up with new technologies and ways of understanding the world around us. So this investigation into how many new species might even be in Virginia involves going through historic records and documents and field studies and surveys and photographs to try to track down the locations where former scientists have hypothesized new species might be. And this work is already bringing up some really cool and interesting findings, such as a new species of salamander in Southwest Virginia and North Carolina that's going to be incredibly range restricted and therefore requiring conservation protection in North Carolina, as well as a species that's found in Southwest Virginia that the only known locality we have thus far is highly threatened by bisection with the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So this work starts to take on a different turn of needing to happen as quickly as possible so we can conserve and protect these species before their habitats are completely lost. So now I've told you how I kind of go about looking into seeing if there might be more species and where I might go to look for them, but how do I recognize when I find a new species? And this is another really cool question that I love about being a scientist. How do we find new species and how do we tell them apart from other species? And we're going to do one final Ask the Audience. I promise this is my last Poll the Audience question, because it's not always as obvious as you might think when you're holding a new species in your hand or you're finding one in the wild or you're looking through historical records. So I have 3 different individuals pictured up here on the screen, 3 different salamanders found in our region. And I'm going to ask this question. I want you to raise your hand when I ask if you think these are all the same species or if these are all different species. So all the same species pictured up on here. Okay, a couple people. 3 different species. Okay. People think I'm being tricky. I always am being tricky. And so here's the big reveal. These are 3 different species of salamander. Yes, we got some people who are like, we're right, awesome. I love that. What were you guessing? That's the real question. So these are 3 different species of salamander, and as you can see from these photographs, it's really difficult to tell that they actually are different species. And I'll be honest with you, if I saw these pictures, I would not be able to tell that they're different species, because there's more to the story than just seeing what the individual looks like, the body patterning, the position, the shape of the head. There's a lot more to that. I would not have necessarily got this right, even though I am a herpetology curator. And the way that this kind of presents is that, in fact, some species look the same, but they're incredibly different. And so these 3 pictures up here all look pretty unique in comparison to the photographs from the last page. But in fact, these are all 3 species of Desmognathus fuscus, or the northern dusky salamander from northeastern Virginia, or northeastern United States. These photographs were taken, and they look really different, but they're all the same. So what I can tell you is, it's not just me or the audience members that have been confused by this, but in fact, over time, scientists have also been very confused. We're constantly finding what feels like a species hidden in plain sight, because it's really, really difficult to tell these individuals apart when they display extreme polymorphism or differences in their coloration that has nothing to do with being a different species. So when every single species looks the same, Arianna, how do you tell them apart? How do you describe a new species when they look so incredibly similar? Well, this is a question I'm currently looking into with collaborators from Radford University. And it turns out there's a lot more to salamanders than just their patterns and their body plan and the shapes of their heads and the lengths of their tails. There's a lot more data out there to be gathered. And the first form of this data is one of my favorites. We go to the cells of the individual organism inside the nucleus, and we take out the DNA and we examine it. And so this is the genomes of these salamanders, and they're revealing all kinds of amazing secrets. And just like chimpanzees or gibbons are going to have unique DNA, different species of salamander are going to have unique mutations as well that differentiate them. In addition to that, salamanders have a really beautiful microbiome assemblage of different microorganisms. So just like our gut microbiome serves really important functions for our health, the skin microbiome of a salamander is actually a really important defense mechanism and the only innate defense they have against fungal and viral pathogens that are a huge threat to their survival. So we're also going and examining salamanders and swabbing them and figuring out how their microbiomes might be different. And then the last piece of data that we're investigating is the pheromones of salamanders. For those of you that don't know, salamanders engage in these really intricate courtship displays during the mating season. Not all of them, but many of them do. And this involves specialized proteins called pheromones that help communicate between individuals what's happening. And so in this picture right here, we have a male with a mental gland on the chin, rubbing some pheromones onto the female, which will be absorbed into her skin and will communicate really important signaling to her about their mating behavior. So in this sense, we have all these additional pieces of data to help tell us how salamanders might be different pheromones, different microbial assemblages, and different genetics. And so in addition to that, that sort of comes back to this question of why are Virginia salamanders so diverse? Well, first we needed to know how many there were, then we needed to know how we tell them apart, and then lastly, why are they so diverse? Well, to answer your question, TBD. We're still looking into this. This is a question that I'm actively investigating with my research program. But perhaps just as important as to why Virginia's salamanders are so diverse is how can we ensure the future of this fantastic diversity for such a threatened group of vertebrates. So probably one of the central tenets of my research program is also to understand that question as well. How can we protect and conserve them? What are major threats to them in their environments? How resilient are they going to be to future change? And the way I'm investigating this with collaborators is looking into the thermal preferences of different species in the region, meaning what's the preferred temperature that these salamanders like to hang out on and how different is it across species? And it turns out this is really important. This is one of my little salamander experiment participants right here in his little maze. And so we're understanding thermal preference. He's kind of navigating through his maze to understand which parts of the tub have the temperature that he likes best. Because if we can understand what temperature they like best, we can understand how threatened they're going to be as climate continues to change in their external environments. So this is a really important way that we're understanding these threats and how to allow us to predict how they might respond when these threats really come to be. And so where do we study things like climate change and salamanders and new species? We study them at museums. So I'm very, very lucky, very fortunate, and very excited to be at the Virginia Museum of Natural History because these types of questions are most perfectly paired with places like this where we can investigate historical collections in addition to new data we're gathering from our environments. Museums are a snapshot in time and they allow us to ask who, what, where, and when about these species using massive research collections that have been developed over the years and also an opportunity to collaborate with people contributing to and examining those collections as well. But it really doesn't end there. Another really big part of conserving salamanders and protecting this important biodiversity is the community. So science and community members that are passionate about biodiversity and about protecting it are just as important to answering these questions. And so as you move forth from this talk today, I hope you at least have one cool salamander fact to share at dinner. But in addition to that, I hope that you are inspired to share love for these animals as well and different ways that we can engage with our communities to protect them and be inspired to make sure they're here in the future. And with that, I would be happy to take salamander or non-salamander, you can ask me about snake questions as well, why I became a biologist, how I became a biologist, anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, let's make sure we use the microphones for the questions, please.
Thank you for your time.
So you showed us how diverse they are, and certainly they're really diverse. So what makes a salamander a salamander? What's the definition of a salamander?
That is a really good question. It's bringing me back to evolutionary biology. So what makes a salamander a salamander? So we have tetrapods, animals with 4 limbs that have evolved to a massive diversity of things from cats to dogs to salamanders to lizards. And salamanders are one of these really important tetrapod groups. And as they've evolved over time, we have a group like this that respirates through its skin. It has moist glandular skin as well, and certain morphological adaptations that kind of define this group, or scientists have used to define this group, to differentiate it from things like another amphibian, like a frog, or another amphibian group called the caecilian, which I showed earlier on the screen when I was talking about limblessness. And that's sort of what defines the group, is some morphological traits, some behavioral, some physical, glandular traits, and that's kind of what makes them different from lizards. I know sometimes because of having the 4 limbs and the tail and the head, they seem similar to lizards, but they're actually very divergent. Lizards are a lot more similar to something like other lizards, snakes, for example, than they are to something like a salamander. Yeah.
Are animals like blue-tailed skinks similar to newts, or are they newts themselves?
That's a great question. So that kind of comes back to the question that this gentleman also just asked me, which is they're kind of different groups. So although we say I'm a herpetologist and I study reptiles and amphibians, and they're both ectotherms, meaning they're cold-blooded, they're actually really divergent groups. It turns out historically, herpetology, the study of reptiles and amphibians, got grouped together because they're kind of creepy crawlies and they're cold-blooded, but not actually because of their evolutionary history. So although I study both of these animals, they're actually quite divergent. And blue-tongued skinks are going to have totally different skull and head morphology, scales that can be shed, which is really different than the salamanders as well, in addition to another suite of other adaptations that are really cool. But I love blue-tongued skinks.
All right, over there on the end.
If one wanted to provide some habitat on their property for things like this, how would we go about finding how to do that properly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So different salamanders like different things. The biggest shock to me was studying some species from the region that are actually quite active deep in the rock cracks and come out when it's really dry, because I swear I thought it had to be raining to find salamanders, but that's not the case for every single species. So for habitat, things that salamanders like is places to hide during the day when it's hot or when it's sunny or when it's dry. And some of them do spend time deep underground, many of them do, and those are ones that are just going to be burrowed down all on their own. But for ones that are a little more terrestrial than that, things like wooded cover, right where the forest habitat ends, and then there's no other good places for them, things like logs. You might be surprised that some of them are already utilizing some of your wood piles on your properties. Wooden boards, these are things that salamanders tend to like. Moisture gathers under there. But sometimes you might find you have these boards out on your property and you flip them and there are still not salamanders. It might just be things to do with the microhabitat that we can't control in terms of how much available water there is, how far you are from available water sources. That's huge as well, or just the time of year. But I am working to establish a salamander sampling site here in Virginia, which is part of a global network where you have wooden boards out in the forest, and you can flip these wooden boards and count how many salamanders are beneath them, and this is a way that we teach things like community ecology to students at universities. It's part of a global network of data collection. So they might like the wood, but they might not.
How about like creating ponds and things like that?
Yeah, so the gentleman sitting just behind you could tell you more about creating ponds
Oh.
in your yard because he's had great success, and I personally have never built one of these pond habitats, but what I can say from talking to him earlier is that it can be very successful.
Okay.
So I
okay,
recommend
I will
that.
ask him. Thank you.
Why did you decide to become a herpetologist?
I love answering that question. So I always thought, because a lot of my colleagues were like, hey, I caught my first snake when I was 1 year old, and now I'm a herpetologist. They have this like really early origin story. For me, the thing that I really loved my whole life was being outside, and I loved animals, and I loved seeing animals when they were outside. And I also really loved the idea of research science, which meant that I got to ask a question and find a way to answer that question, and then develop that in any way that needed to be to answer these questions that I was inspired by, and then sharing what I found with other people to get them inspired as well. And so when I went to university, I knew I wanted to work in a research lab, and I kind of had this crazy lucky experience where I walked into a lab and I was like, hey, could I work here? And they were like, yeah, you could. And that's kind of how I started doing herpetology. But that doesn't mean to say that you have to get really lucky. It's just to say that if there's something that you really, really like and you think it's really cool, there are a lot more opportunities out there than you think to be involved with herpetology. We have state herpetological societies and a lot of different opportunities to come out and participate in biodiversity surveys to get a feel of like, hey, finding salamanders is something I really love, or I need to work on a species that lives in the desert. It's too cold out here for me with these salamanders. So if you're interested in that, I'm happy to share more later. That's how I ended up being a herpetologist.
I wondered about your thoughts on the ethics of like exploring a vernal pool site and just looking for salamanders in general.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, they have this glandular skin, and we know that they also use their skin for respiration. And so just like, you know, when you pick a fish up out of a pond, you can disrupt that microbiome. And we also know that handling amphibians a lot can also cause stress, it can lower the immune system, and it can make them more susceptible to one of their greatest threats, which is fungal and viral pathogens that kind of attack their skin and then leave them with a lot less surface area for respiration, and then they die. And many species have gone extinct for this. And also many species are incredible microendemics, meaning they're just in this one spot, and the habitat is incredibly delicate. We know these vernal pools are incredibly important breeding sites, and loss of breeding sites or tampering with breeding sites can have a huge impact on fecundity. And so what I can say about that is when we're, research with salamanders is, they're more of a look, don't touch animal. And they're incredibly sensitive. Even though I talked about how they are so resilient, humans were not really something that were in the game plan for something they need to be resilient against. And in addition to that, vernal pools are incredibly fragile. And I believe that many vernal pool sites require permits or permissions to kind of be there. And what I can say, though, is something that I've done in the past is volunteer with local wildlife resource groups. For example, if there's a huge migration and they need help on the ground to kind of deter cars and prevent mortality on the roads, that's a great way to both get to see something, but also be there with a group that has permission to be observing these animals and interacting with them. And again, I'll direct you to this man in the vest sitting in the audience who has an incredible amount of experience with vernal pools. I'm sorry.
Yeah, hi. What gets you really excited?
What gets me really excited? I'll be honest, I was so happy to give this talk because I was like a snake-only person. I was like, I love snakes and they're my thing. I started out working on geckos. They're cool. They're like the coolest lizards. And then, but I always wanted to work on snakes. I had this awesome opportunity during my Ph.D. to do work on snakes in Madagascar, and they're awesome, and it was really fun, and I still am doing work on snakes that I didn't talk about today. But then I moved to Canada to do conservation research, something I'd never done before, on these salamanders in the Canadian Rockies with Parks Canada, and they're just so cool. This animal, in the same way I love snakes because people either love them or they love to hate them, so you get to share like this not fear experience about a cool animal. Salamanders is just people don't even know they're there. So getting to show someone, like when I would take my students out and I'd be like, you want to see a salamander? And I'm like, you see a rock and you're like, oh, I know there's going to be one under this rock. And then you flip it and they're like, oh my gosh. And then they're really excited. That's something that really gets me excited as well.
Are you familiar with Maple Flats? And what do you suppose makes
the
it
man in the vest. Yes.
Salamander Central?
Yes, so I was just told about Maple Flats today at dinner. Actually, this is my first time being in Waynesboro. I'm so excited to be here. If anyone wants to come up later and tell me cool things I should check out, I'm happy to hear it. And Maple Flats came up because to anyone who's not seen these migratory salamanders at these vernal pools, it's just really spectacular, and it's not something that you can see many places in the world. So I've never been to Maple Flats. Have you been to Maple Flats? I would really like to go to Maple Flats. So I'm hopeful that this year, as these things come, I'm going to ask the man in the vest if we can go, or I would love to go with you and your partner. So that'd be really exciting. So yeah.
Hey,
would love to go to
Arianna,
Maple
we have an
Flats.
online question.
Yeah, an online question.
Yes.
Oh, that's so fun.
So from the Facebook Live stream, phone will stay on. Would use of pesticides and herbicides and even fertilizers pose a problem for salamander populations?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, that sensitive skin, so you can imagine things like fertilizers, pesticides. It's one reason why, again, the handling of salamanders, not a great idea. You can imagine just even slapping on some bug spray, and then you go out to where the salamanders are, which is also where the bugs are, and you pick them up. That can have a huge impact on them. So as that leaches into the environment and even into their things like their ponds and pools that they live in, even things like eutrophication, shifts in predator-prey dynamics, and the trophic webs that are there, that's going to have an impact on them. But again, just like frogs, these are environmental indicators. As soon as things go bad, pollution, eutrophication of these water systems, it's going to have a huge impact on salamanders. And what we find with amphibians is some of these species are gone before we even had the chance to describe them. So yeah, absolutely, that's going to be a problem for a lot of species. But yet, what we are finding is some species have some resilience to land development, but most species are incredibly sensitive.
All right, thank you for that. And we're not going to go anywhere, but we're going to go ahead and end this kind of formalized part of tonight's presentation. But before we thank Arianna, I just want to point out our nonprofit partners that are making this lecture series, as well as our branch campus down the street, possible. We have our long partner, the Center for Cold Waters Restoration, has always been a great partner here with the Virginia Museum of Natural History. We have the South River Watershed Coalition, which is all about engaging and learning about the South River, and they're actually an important partner for tonight's lecture and the entire lecture series. And lastly, of course, the Wayne Theater has been a wonderful partner for these lectures. So let's thank Arianna one more time, and we'll see you next month.
Awesome, thanks.